and welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On today's show, we're going to take a deep dive into a topic that came directly from one of you. It was submitted it was a question I got on my AMA. The question was about trauma bonding. Now, before I get into all of this, I want to take a moment to say thank you to all of you who've been tuning in, following, sharing the show, and reaching out with your questions and your feedback. The growth of this audience has been both really humbling for me and very encouraging. So if you are finding value in these episodes, do me a favor. Make sure you are following along, you've subscribed on the platform of your choice. You take a moment, do me a favor. Can you rate the show 5 stars, especially if you're on Spotify? It allows others to find the show, maybe hear some of these conversations that we all need. And do me a favor, if you can, leave a review. It does help other people find it, and it keeps everything moving forward. And if you want to support the show directly, you'll find a donation link in my show's description. I also want to apologize about something else. You might hear some background noise. I'm going to do my best later on to get rid of it. There's a helicopter working outside, so it's going to be kind of loud at moments. I do apologize. Can't do much about that today, but, such is life. All right, let's get into this here. Trauma bonding. It's one of those terms that really does get thrown around a lot, especially these days and online, a lot more so on social media. You're going to hear it pop up in relationship advice threads, social media posts, and even sometimes casual conversations. But too often what people are actually describing isn't the clinical reality of trauma bonding. So today I'm going to kind of get under the hood a bit here. We're not going to look at or do pop psychology, which I know a lot of these kink-related shows do this. They throw out dime store psychology about things. They don't really give you a better, deeper understanding. So this isn't going to be just a list of quick slogans or surface-level takes, because the truth is, trauma bonding is real. It's clinically recognizable, and it's something that impacts people across all sorts of relationships, whether we're talking about so-called our vanilla relationships or our dynamics that involve power exchange, kink, or even some sort of alternative relationship structure. Smart, capable, and highly self-aware people can find themselves trapped in it. And part of it, why it's so powerful, is because it taps into something very old inside of us, a survival pattern that often started long before the relationship ever existed. So we're going to break this down today in really simple but honest terms. What it is, how it works, how it shows up differently depending on the dynamic you're in, and how to begin recognizing if you're caught in the cycle. So let's start at the beginning. What trauma bonding actually is, right? So let's start by really defining what we mean when we talk about this. At its core, trauma bonding is an attachment that forms around cycles of emotional pain, intermittent relief, or even survival coping. It's not simply about being attracted to someone who treats you poorly. That's too simplistic. What we're really looking at here is a bond that gets wired into place when love, safety, and threat all start to get paired together. And the engine that drives this is something called intermittent reinforcement. You don't get the same response every time. Sometimes you get warmth, connection, even deep intimacy. Other times you get withdrawal, criticism, distance, silence. The inconsistency here becomes part of the hook. You start chasing those good moments. The rare, unpredictable payoff feels powerful, and that craving to get back to it actually strengthens the attachment. This isn't just emotional, it's neurological. Your nervous system isn't designed to evaluate whether a relationship is healthy. It's designed to secure connection to your attachment figures, especially when there's a risk of losing them. If the person who soothes you is also the person who hurts you, your system fuses those experiences together. You don't separate love and pain. They become two sides of the same coin. Now, here's where people often misunderstand trauma bonding. The pull isn't purely about the person, it's about the cycle itself. You're attached to the process, the rupture, the anxiety, the pursuit, the relief. The emotional relief after distress feels intense, and that surge of relief reinforces the bond. Every time you feel like you've fixed it or made your partner happy again, your brain gives you a hit of dopamine and oxytocin, chemicals that strengthen the attachment. That's why trauma bonding often feels addictive, because it is. The brain gets hooked on Intermittent reward. The nervous system starts to mistake volatility for emotional depth, and ironically, stability can start to feel foreign or even uncontrollable. And I want to be clear here. This isn't about weakness. It's not about knowing better. This is about how the human nervous system operates. We're wired for survival first, attachment second, and logic somewhere much further down the list. If you grew up in an environment where love came with inconsistency, even in a family that looked functional on the outside, your system adapted. You learned how to be hyper attuned to emotional shifts. You read people. You anticipated their moods. That vigilance helped you stay connected to them and in some cases stay safe. But this is where the trap is. Those early adaptations set the blueprint for what love feels like later. And because inconsistency became familiar, your nervous system starts to interpret chaos and volatility, even anxiety, as a kind of comfort. It feels like home, not because it's good, but because it's familiar. And that's why highly intelligent, capable people find themselves stuck in trauma bonds. Knowing better doesn't break the cycle. The nervous system isn't convinced by insight alone. It reacts to patterns, to relief after fear, to the unpredictable reinforcement that keeps you emotionally engaged. And trauma bonding isn't always obvious abuse. It can be subtle. A partner who withdraws affection during conflict only to return later with reassurance. A cycle of emotional distancing followed by apologies and reconnection. These micro patterns build over time. The relationship becomes less about stability and more about managing emotional risk. You're not just invested in the person, you're now invested in avoiding the rupture, chasing that repair, and holding on to moments of relief. And that's what makes trauma bonding feel so powerful. It's not just that you love them. It's that your system has wired itself to seek safety through the tolerating that instability with them. You're craving the soothing that comes after the pain, that cycle that becomes its own form of attachment. And this applies across all sorts of relationships, not just romantic ones. It happens in family systems, friendships, workplaces, and yes, inside of the community as well. The emotional system doesn't care what kind of relationship you're in. It cares about the pattern underneath. So with that foundation that we've kind of laid out here, let's start to take a closer look at how this shows up every day in so-called our vanilla relationships or lifestyle ones, because for many people, that's where these patterns start playing out first. So now that we have this understanding of what trauma bonding actually is, let's talk about how it shows up in everyday relationships outside of power exchange, outside of kink, outside of the lifestyle, the relationships most people are familiar with. Now, one of the biggest hallmarks of trauma bonding is the cycle of chasing repair. You have a rupture, maybe a fight, the withdrawal, shutdown of some kind of conflict. There's pain, there's anxiety, there's disconnection, and then eventually, the other person re-engages. They apologize. They soften, right? They draw you back in. And that reconnection feels huge. It feels powerful. It feels like relief. You go from distress back to intimacy. And that swing from anxiety to closeness is part of what locks people into the cycle. Over time, you stop noticing how often the rupture is happening, and you become focused on managing your way back towards the repair. You learn what to say and what not to say. You learn how to soothe the other person, how to smooth things over. The pattern becomes about avoiding rupture, chasing the reconnection, and minimizing the distress in between. And here's where the trap deepens. The cycle itself becomes addictive. You start associating love with not, something steady or reliable closeness, but with the intensity of the relief that comes after the tension. The spike of intimacy feels stronger because it follows the pain. You crave the repair more than you actually crave the partner themselves. It's not the person that's addictive, it's the emotional roller coaster. And in many ways, this becomes a form of emotional reenactment. Without realizing it, people start replaying unresolved attachment wounds from earlier in life. So if you grew up with a parent who was unpredictable, maybe who swung between warmth and coldness, or who was emotionally unavailable unless you performed or pleased, your system learned to chase those moments of approval, right? You developed hyper attunement. You watched out for their cues. You adapted your behavior to secure or even in those brief moments of connection. And as adults, the same attachment template plays out again. You might find yourself repeatedly drawn to partners who are emotionally inconsistent or who have, high emotional needs, but also sharp emotional lows. You find yourself working hard to hold the relationship steady, believing that you can manage it right, and then you'll finally achieve stable love that you wanted all along. But underneath that, you're not repairing this relationship. You're unconsciously trying to repair the ones that came before it. And that's what makes trauma reenactment so difficult to spot, because it feels like love. It feels familiar. But what you're really doing is replaying old survival patterns that were never fully resolved. And again, it doesn't mean you're broken. It doesn't mean you're foolish. This is just how the nervous system wires itself to when it's exposed to early relational unpredictability, right? You're not drawn to these dynamics because you enjoy suffering. You're drawn to them because your attachment system is trying in its own way to finally get it right, to finally achieve safety through fixing what was once unstable. And this is why people often describe calm, healthy relationships as feeling boring at first, because stability doesn't trigger the same emotional spikes. There's no anxiety. There's no desperate chase. Just steady, consistent presence. And for someone whose nervous system has been wired for instability, that can feel oddly empty. Not because it is empty, but because it's unfamiliar. So maybe in non-lifestyle relationships, trauma bonding isn't always loud. It's a lot more subtle. It shows up as a constant undercurrent of managing emotional risk, working hard to avoid conflict, feeling a surge of hope when things feel good again, and often losing sight of how much effort is going into simply keeping that connection afloat. And this is the heart of trauma bonding. You're attached not to a stable mutual relationship, but to the process of managing the instability of it. Now, obviously, these same patterns can show up and often do inside of our lifestyle dynamics, but when power dynamics are involved, it can get even more complicated. So let's take a look about how this might show up in the lifestyle context next, and how about trauma bonding, or how does trauma bonding can take shape there, right? So let's really start to unpack this now, where and how it can show up in our relationships dynamics, in our power exchanges, because this is where things can even get more layered. First, I want to be clear about something. Kink is not a problem. Power exchange isn't automatically unhealthy. In fact, some of the most intentional, communicative, emotionally attuned relationships I've seen are within lifestyle and kink-related spaces. Power dynamics introduce complexity, and if certain patterns aren't examined, trauma bonding can hide inside the very structures people believe are keeping them safe. And here's why it gets tricky. For some people, surrender feels safe, but for the wrong reasons. When you've grown up adapting to unpredictable relationships, you often learn that compliance is the fastest path to emotional stability. You get good at reading people. You anticipate all of their needs. You stay hyper-attuned to their mood shifts. And in power exchange, surrendering to someone else's authority can feel oddly comforting because it echoes that old survival mechanism. The submissive might say, I trust you completely, but sometimes that trust isn't coming from true safety. It's coming from a deeply wired belief that if I stay small enough, give enough, please just enough, maybe I won't be abandoned. And the dynamic allows them to lean into a familiar role where their needs are secondary, but where at least they can feel secure in being good. And on the other side of this, dominance can also become a mask for unresolved emotional needs. For some dominants, control provides emotional security. The power dynamic allows them to avoid vulnerability because they're always in charge. They may structure care and control not because they're grounded, but because they're anxious underneath, anxious about being rejected, about being insufficient, about being truly seen or known. And in this sense, their dominance is less about consensual leadership and more about emotional management. And because kink naturally involves explicit power structures, these patterns are often misread as consensual roles rather than red flags. Both people can honestly believe they're operating inside fully negotiated dynamics because technically they are. The scene may be negotiated, the protocols may be discussed, the rules might be written down, but underneath, if one person's attachment system is still operating out of fear of abandonment, fear of losing love, fear of being discarded, then that consent is sitting on shaky ground. And this is part of why trauma bonding in the kink world is so difficult to spot. The structure of power exchange can feel like providing safety when in fact it's recreating old, early survival patterns. The submissive feels safe because they're surrendering. The dominant feels safe because they're in control. But neither is actually confronting the underlying emotional wounds that are driving the dynamic. And let's talk about intensity for a moment. Because one of the most seductive parts of trauma bonding, especially in the lifestyle, is how powerful the connection feels. The scenes are intense, the aftercare is intimate, the trust feels deep. But what many mistake for intimacy is often just emotional intensity. And intensity can feel a lot like love when your nervous system is wired to equate emotional spikes with depth. But in healthy kink relationships, we know that they're built on ongoing consent, open dialogue, negotiations, emotional agency, and the capacity to say no without fear of rupture. Both people can engage in deep vulnerability without losing the dynamic to stabilize their own insecurity. There's room for renegotiation and for expression, even for change. But in trauma reenactment, vulnerability feels unsafe unless it's tightly controlled. The submissive may stay silent to avoid disappointing their dominant. The dominant may push limits to reassure themselves of the submissive's devotion. The dynamic becomes less about mutual growth and more about managing each person's anxiety. And the most challenging part is that both people often feel deeply connected because the cycle itself is rewarding in the short term. The anxiety, the chase, the repair. It reinforces the bond, which is exactly why it's so powerful and exactly why it's so hard to recognize when you are inside of it. Now, there are red flags to watch out for, and we need to break some of these down. Not because I'm asking you to dismantle your relationships, but I'm asking you to take a look at what you might be inside of, or some of the things you may be missing out on, so you don't let this pattern continually progress forward. So let's break this down and understand some of the red flags that often show up when someone's caught in this cycle of trauma bonding. Because it's not always obvious at first, by the way. The patterns build really slowly. And often people don't realize how far they've drifted until they are already way deep inside of the relationship. Now, the first major one is what we call the chronic rupture repair cycles. I've kind of already mentioned this before. You have a conflict, a fight, or some sort of emotional rupture, right? That rupture starts to create the anxiety, fear. Sometimes it's silent treatment. Sometimes it's explosive arguments. But then comes the repair, the apologies, the tenderness, the reconnection. And that reconnection feels huge, right? You feel relief. It feels meaningful. It feels like everything has been restored. You believe in the relationship again. But over time, the relationship becomes less about growing together and more about surviving these waves. You're constantly managing the emotional distance. You're trying to avoid the rupture or working overtime to repair it. You may find yourself walking on eggshells trying to prevent the next cycle, even though down deep you know it's going to happen again. The longer the pattern runs, the more your emotional world narrows to manage that cycle. Another red flag is justifying harm in the name of love or devotion. Now, this usually starts with something small. They didn't mean it. They were just triggered. It's only because they care so deeply. Slowly, the behavior that hurt you gets reframed as evidence of passion or investment. Even harmful patterns, yelling, silent treatment, emotional withdrawal gets justified because admitting they're harmful would force you to question the entire connection. And when you're bonded through survival attachment, questioning that connection feels very dangerous. So instead, you reframe it here as love. This is often where self-blame sneaks in. You start wondering, am I being too sensitive? Am I expecting too much of them? Maybe this is really my issue. That internal dialogue becomes part of your bond. You take responsibility for managing the other person's reactions. You downplay your own hurt. You convince yourself that staying calm, staying agreeable is how you maintain peace. Then comes isolation. Not always dramatic, but progressive. You stop sharing certain details with friends or family. You avoid conversations where people might challenge the relationship. You might even distance yourself from people you once trusted, not because they've changed, but because you fear their perspective will force you to confront something you're not ready to see. And as your world narrows, the person you bonded with becomes your primary, sometimes your only source of emotional connection. That isolation deepens dependency. You're no longer just trying to maintain the relationship. You start believing your emotional survival depends on it. Another pattern that almost always emerges is your growing tolerance for boundary violations. Things that you once told yourself you'd never accept to start becoming normalized. Maybe a disrespectful comment, a broken agreement or promise. Maybe if they were being demeaning towards you. And every time it happens, you tell yourself, well, you know what? It's not that bad. They didn't really mean it. And you adjust. You accommodate. You shrink your expectations a little bit more. The boundaries you once held start eroding. Not all at once, but brick by brick, piece by piece. And after a while, what once was totally acceptable for you now feels just like another part of the relationship. And underneath all of this, there's often this painful internal tug of war. I know this isn't healthy, but I really can't leave. You see the dysfunction, you know what the damage is, but the emotional bond feels stronger than the evidence in front of you. And that's because your attachment system is still trying to secure safety, even if safety means tolerating instability, right? Your nervous system is wired to protect connections at all costs. And when that connection feels at risks, even harm becomes negotiable. And I really want to pause here and say this again. This doesn't make you foolish. It doesn't mean you're broken or incapable. This is what happens when survival patterns hijack your attachment. Your nervous system isn't deciding what's healthy. It's deciding for you what is familiar and what's not. And when it's familiar, it often feels safer than something that's, unfamiliar, like peace and calm and consistency. This is exactly why trauma bonding is so powerful and so difficult to break. Because the pain and the repair become two sides of the same bond. And you're not just attached to the person, you're attached to the process that keeps promising relief while it slowly wears you down. Look, if you're hearing this and you're recognizing some of these patterns, I want to be clear about something. Trauma bonding isn't stupidity. It's not about weakness. It's not about brokenness. And I see these questions. I get asked these things constantly. I get emails about them. Am I broken? Is there something wrong with me? It often stems from a survival pattern. These are deeply wired adaptations to your nervous systems that were created long before you ever had the words for what was happening. Your brain learned that in order to stay connected, sometimes you had to tolerate instability. And when that becomes your attachment blueprint, it can follow you into adulthood, even into relationships, right? Especially the ones you so desperately want to be different. But being wired this way doesn't mean you're doomed to keep repeating it. You're not stuck. You're not destined to relive the same patterns forever. But healing begins with awareness. Ending this cycle takes time. With calling the pattern what it is, not excusing it, not minimizing it, but seeing it clearly from there, healing often requires an outside perspective. Now, whether that's professional support, trusted people in your life who aren't caught inside of that emotional loop with you, people who can reflect what you may not be able to fully see while you're inside of this relationship. And most importantly here, healing requires compassion for yourself. Not shame, not degradation, not self-blame, but real understanding for why these patterns took hold to begin with. And that's this real hard truth. Trauma bonding doesn't mean you're addicted to the pain. It means your nervous system still believes safety can be earned by tolerating it. But real safety never demands that you stay in harm to prove your worth. And that's the line I want you to carry with you. And I'm going to leave you all with a question today. When you think of safety in a relationship, does it feel like calm or does it feel like relief? Because those two things feel very different. And sometimes that difference is where the work begins. Now, I know this was a bigger show today. This is a very loaded question. This wasn't something I could answer in a paragraph or so on my AMA, which is why I brought it here today. I want to apologize again for the noise. I can't control it. I don't know what the heck they're doing outside. I don't know. They're transporting crap. It's really annoying. It's been affecting me all day. They've been going at it since literally 8 a.m., driving me insane. However, with that said, I have some other things that are coming up. I do want to let you all know I've been in touch. I was on another show. I think I've already mentioned it. Was on the Authentically Kinky podcast. I believe I've been told that episode is going to come out July 8th. I will let you all know when that surfaces. I'm going to promote that. I am going to bring on Hi There Catsuit onto the show here in the near future. I've still got to sit down. I want to apologize to Red Warrior and to my other guest that is in the Middle East. We definitely need to talk, especially with some current events. I don't want to get into politics on my show because that's not what this is about. But I understand that the world is changing right now and there's a lot of conflict and turmoil. A lot of people are nervous. So I think a show right now, I'm going to try to reach out and get that done here in the near future because I think it's going to be really important to do. My book. Yes, I keep getting this question and I'm going to keep repeating it. And I actually I was speaking to a client about it this past week. Look, my book is called Tangled Desires, The Intersection Between Psychology and BDSM. It's not a Pulitzer Prize winner, right? It's the first thing I ever wrote. It's a little repetitive. It's a little verbose. It's got a little bit of extra psychology, but you know what? It was my first book. It's what happens. Not a whole lot I can do there. It's not the greatest thing you're going to read, but it's got some key insights, right? You can get that wherever you get your ebooks from, or there is a print version for yourself, right? I have a good friend who always reminds me to promote myself, and I should. But let me know what you thought about this show today. I know there's a lot more to this conversation that people want to have about it, and I'm fine with that. You can get a hold of me on my socials, contact me through Substack, Fetlife. You can contact me even through the show or send me a direct email at the kinkperspective@gmail.com. If you need to talk, I'm here to listen, right? I also want to be clear about something somebody asked me, and I just want to kind of put this out there. I don't get into if you ask me a question that's therapeutically related, I'm probably not going to respond to it. I can't. You need to understand that therapists have limits. And there's certain things we can answer in a public sphere, and there is certain things we can't. Now, some therapists may want to answer everything. That's fine. But I respect that, and that's part of my code of ethics. So I'm not. So some of the questions, yes, I haven't gotten to, and somebody's sent me a couple of emails, why aren't you answering my question? That's really the reason. I just can't. So you can take that up with others. That's fine. I do understand, but there's not a whole lot I can do. And I just appreciate if we can kind of keep the questions focused on lifestyle or psychology or maybe how something shows up. And I'm willing to look into it, maybe give you a response, or like I did today, do a show on it. So if you do have any questions or something else you want me to look into, let me know and we'll bring it up and discuss it and go from there. Until next time, everybody, be safe. Stay cool.